King Salmon, monarch of fish. Man destroyed the king's habitat, dammed his runs, fished him nearly into extinction. Now, man is cleaning the king's rivers, hatching and raising his fry, restoring his kingdom. This is Raymond Burr, inviting you to follow this triumphant story, the return of the king. The summer of 1986 was not unusual, except record numbers of king salmon were encountered by fishermen off the California coast. That autumn also was not unusual, but the best salmon runs in years coursed upstream to spawning sites along California rivers. The reason for this return of the salmon, a fish that virtually disappears into the depths of the Pacific Ocean for the greater part of its life, is not clear. But clearly, the concerned intervention by man is the most important factor influencing the survival of the king salmon, monarch of fish. From the dawn of the Ice Age until the mid-19th century, the king salmon lived its complicated life cycle with little variation. The miracle of a salmon's life begins when eggs are spawned in clean river gravels. After hatching, the young fry emerge to forage for food and begin their difficult journey to the ocean. After a remarkable adaptation to seawater, termed smoltification, the young fish enter the ocean, a rich feeding ground which they will range for 2 or 3 years or even longer, growing, maturing, preparing to return to the waters of their birth. The mature males and females track the scent of their home streams, complete the arduous journey, spawn and die. Their bodies enrich the food chain on which their offspring dine, and this unique circle of life begins again. When the first Europeans sailed along the western coast of the United States, they found a pristine land of lavish resources and a people living in accord with nature. The Native Americans were harvesting a truly renewable resource, the king salmon. All too quickly, this historic balance was upset forever. Mining, timber, and agricultural practices destroyed spawning grounds. Commercial gill netting on many rivers depleted stocks. California's integrated water diversion project, the largest system of its kind in the world, further reduced the king salmon's habitat. In the Sacramento-San Joaquin system alone, 6,000 miles of the king's spawning ground has diminished to less than 300 miles today. Dr. Joel Hedgepeth recalls citizen concerns in the late 1930s and his days as a civil service biologist.
But Shasta Dam was to take the main stem of the Sacramento River below the influx of the McCloud and Pitt rivers. That's an awful lot of river. And so the whole program was started under the Bureau of Reclamation with no consideration for studying this fish to see if there were any there to begin with, and if there were, what they were going to do with them, because the dam would be too high for a fish ladder. Questions were raised by the Tyee Club and I think other people that what was going to happen to the fish. there really any left, or if so, it's been done it out. So we started in. And we found the number of fish a great deal more than anybody had anticipated.
Throughout the 30s and 40s and 50s, those voices of concern were unheard in the stampede for development. The king salmon continued to disappear.
Those early years during each season, of course, the price was a lot less, but you were getting, you could buy more for $1, so that balanced off. But during a season's time, you always had at least 7, 8, 10, 15 days, depending on the season, of 100 fish days. And now if you get one of those in a season, you got a real high point.
By 1960, sport and commercial fishing groups had awakened to the need for active participation in fisheries management to guarantee the king salmon's future. By the end of that decade, the Citizens Advisory Committee on Salmon and Steelhead Trout had been created in response to proposals to curtail fishing seasons.
That was a rebellion against the allocations game, which as I have come to call it, a game that allocates a dwindling resource between competing public user groups, but fails to address the base problems. The salmon users, both sport and commercial, got together in a hurry following that fish and game regulatory proposal, and came up with a package, a very comprehensive package.
Their recommendations never were financed properly by the legislature to be carried out, but citizens groups started to pick those recommendations up and do them on their own, with their own monies.
One example of this is the Salmon Stamp Program. Beginning in 1978, California's commercial salmon trawlers imposed a yearly tax upon themselves to provide funds for salmon restoration. And this is just one example of the positive response by sports and commercial groups alike to protect and increase the population of the king salmon.
A farmer cannot go out and harvest a crop without maintaining the soil, planting seed, cultivating, irrigating. He must do all of these things before he can harvest a crop. And I feel very strongly that I, as a harvester of a renewable resource, must, like a farmer, contribute to the well-being of that resource. If I don't contribute to the well-being of that resource, I don't feel like I have quite as much right to it as I do otherwise.
As with other renewable resources, the management of the king salmon is increasingly complicated in a modern world. Setting dates for fishing seasons involves multiple jurisdictions, generates days of debates and volumes of regulations. Everyone may not agree about the rules, but everyone does agree on the critical issue of saving the salmon from destruction.
There are estimates that California is going to have a population of about 30 million people by the year 2000. Those people are going to need recreation, they're going to need a share in the resource. And without more involvement by concerned public, I'm afraid that the critical habitat for all our resources, including the fish, are going to be under siege.
The mainstay of salmon rearing in California's Great Central Valley has been the hatchery.
Here in the Sacramento San Joaquin system, the ecosystem has changed so markedly just in the last 20 years, let alone over the last 100 years, that those fish that are now spawning in the wild, I would be willing to bet, bear no resemblance to what was spawning in the wild 100 years ago, just because the ones that have survived are the ones that have adapted to the altered ecosystem. So we're not dealing with a pristine environment. We're dealing with groups of fish that have already adapted to a changed ecosystem. And what we're trying to do with our hatchery management programs is to continue that adaptation so that we continue to have good runs of salmon despite the fact that the ecosystem is being altered to the detriment of those fish that are spawning in the wild.
Despite the adverse effects of disease epidemics, uncertain funding, and the wiles of politics, somehow these hatcheries continue to provide steady runs of healthy salmon from the rivers back to the ocean waters.
So if you put a dam across a river, there's never going to be a wild salmon run above that dam. So a hatchery is a very appropriate tool to mitigate for the loss of habitat caused by that dam. Hatchery production on the Sacramento River system is what's supporting the bulk of the trawl industry on the ocean right now.
Twin challenges face California's hatchery program: increase production of this magnificent fish and improve the survival rate. The goal, to maintain a $48 million a year commercial and sport fishing industry. At the Feather River Hatchery, the first challenge is being met by the construction of an annex of rearing ponds.
The Feather River Hatchery was built by the Department of Water Resources to compensate for the effects of the Oroville project, the large Oroville Dam and the Thermalito diversion system. That hatchery used to raise between 4 and 5 million smolt-sized fish, fish that were ready to go to sea. With the addition of the Thermalito ponds, we're able to move fish from Feather River over to Thermalito. They grow like crazy. We put them in the truck, we haul them down the estuary, we then move other fish in behind them. And by turning those fish over, we've increased the capacity of that system, if you would, the whole Feather River system, to 14 million smolt-sized fish.
Bird netting at the Mokelumne River Fish Facility protects fingerlings from hungry heron, egrets, and even blackbirds, who once gobbled up 50 to 75% of the baby salmon. Further south on the Merced River, a medium-sized facility has dramatically increased the fish run.
The runs in the Merced River were a few hundred fish, and even those could be attributed primarily to strays off one of the other San Joaquin systems. And that program has increased the base run in the Merced to about a couple of thousand fish instead of a couple of hundred. In addition, that base run then saturates the environment when they have big runoff years in the Merced.
Habitat, once thought lost forever, is coming alive. A success story is being written. A strong story of positive results achieved by coupling good old-fashioned common sense with scientific knowledge to create a strong, progressive system of hatchery management in California.
About 10 years ago, the standard for hatchery practice was to raise the smolt-sized fish, the 3-inch fish, and release them at the hatchery.
Once hatched, the young fry are prey to many predators. Why not, reasoned the fishermen, protect the fingerlings by barging them down the Sacramento and bait wells of albacore boats? They tried it, it worked. Now this remarkable alternative to on-site release of the salmon is being continued by truck.
What we've found is that if we can put those same fish in a truck, haul them down to the estuary, get them past all the predators, all the diversions, all the possible things that are going to kill them on their downstream migration pathway, we can quadruple their survival.
I like to think of where we are as a continuing experiment, because tomorrow is not going to be like today. We can do the kinds of things that we're doing now to make sure that we have hatchery-reared fish into the system. That's important. We have to be making a concerted effort to make sure that there are habitats created. We have very little habitat in terms of what we had historically. And whether you're a taker or a non-taker, habitat is still the most important part of management as I see it in a very complex state like California is becoming.
At the border where California meets Oregon, small teams of fish and game agents struggle to maintain 450 miles of salmon habitat. Another threat to the young fish, ludicrous as it may sound, are alfalfa fields. Thousands of baby kings are sucked through irrigation pipes, left stranded, and die. Man's ingenuity to the rescue. Water-powered, self-cleaning fish screens now prevent many king salmon fingerlings from being drawn into the ditches and certain death.
And then you guys got to look at the root stuff too. I see if that needs another blast. Figure out where we're going to put it at.
In remote areas, workers pack in hand tools and explosives to revitalize streams suffering from decades of logging activity. And in more accessible areas, along that great historic habitat, the tributaries of the Klamath River, rehabilitation moves ahead as rapidly as manpower and funding allow. Sometimes it seems these efforts to undo the damage man has inflicted on the king salmon's realm are too few, too far between.
Sometimes, though, I wonder where it's going. There's enough work here to keep us going the next 100 years, easy, just in rehabilitating the habitat that's been lost. Each year, they're putting in more hay fields. They're using more water. I don't know as we have the right to stop that, but there's only so much water. We need some in-stream flows to maintain fish life.
Here on Bogus Creek, however, a quiet walk along a rejuvenated stream can be enough to revive a sense of hope, however brief, during the autumn spawning run. By the 1970s, an entirely new approach to salmon restoration began to surface. Individuals and community organizations began to rear king salmon on their own. Even this new approach ran into a major stumbling block.
They were in a position where all they could do was sort of beg the state for surplus fish and then take them to their pond at 10 Mile River and raise them. And that was a good program, but it still made us totally dependent on the Department of Fish and Game. So I asked them, well, why don't we hatch our own fish?
And why not? They lobbied for a plan based on a successful Canadian program. In Canada, they were hatching fish in simple wooden boxes.
We went to work to try and convince the Department of Fish and Game that this was a good idea. They didn't like it. They felt that hey, here's a bunch of amateurs, and they basically wanted to play around with a wooden box out in the woods and do the same thing that we do in our high-technology hatcheries. It's highly skilled work. The chances that you'll fail are almost certain, and no, we won't let you do it.
Hatchery people felt that they were the only ones who could raise salmon, and then they found out that citizens could raise them with their own ideas also. And you know, the resistance in the early hatchbox programs was tremendous by our staff, really. And I think that's overcome now.
At last, the determination and perseverance of these grassroots fish farmers won state approval for long-term, decentralized salmon rearing.
And we were successful. And this program's been going on now for 7 years. This will be the 8th year that we've planted fish here. And we've got more fish here this year than we've ever had before. Got about 10,000 fish down there in the box.
Today, there are more than 25 groups of enthusiastic men, women, and children working on projects. Projects that range from simply rearing and releasing baby salmon to sophisticated watershed management programs. 4 of these are located in the fog-shrouded canyons of California's North Coast mountains. A highly productive site has been established at Hollow Tree Creek, primarily through the efforts and funding of commercial trawlers. Recently, with the addition of a small on-site hatchery, their direct autonomous contribution to the salmon industry was secured.
Those eggs never leave there. We used to have to spawn our fish, send our eggs to the hatchery. They kept them till they were fingerlings, then brought them back and put them in the pond. Now those eggs never leave there.
As the crow flies, the Mattole is just a few miles to the northwest of Hollow Tree Creek. Here, the concern and pride of landowners along a remote watershed protects the stand of old-growth timber at the Mattole's headwaters and preserves the ecology of spawning grounds on small tributaries. The cooperative efforts of present-day residents is much akin to the communal spirit of yesteryear, when salmon ran these rivers in uncounted thousands. Over a ridge from the Mattole, the Rotary Club of Garberville actively supports a rearing program. In this area, dependent upon tourism and sports fishing, increased numbers of king salmon and steelhead make good sense, good economics, good ecology.
The economic justification of the independent projects here on the North Coast is real simple. It's about a 10-to-1 return on the money that's spent. For every dollar you put in, you're going to get $10 back. Over time, this continues to repay itself, whether it's in culture terms or habitat terms.
Scott Downey has spearheaded a restoration program on Redwood Creek, a tributary of the South Fork of the Eel River.
But there's more to it than just simple economic justification. There's a heritage here. There's a cause for stewardship. And the old-timers around here talk about the fish keeping their dogs awake at night barking because the fish are splashing and making noise in the creek at night. There's a value to that. And a lot of the people involved in these projects are just volunteers. They're not fishermen, and they see that real cultural value of bringing those fish back. And by golly, we're in a position where we can really make an impact on the future of this resource.
Okay, grab 101.
Trapping and rearing these descendants of an Ice Age fish is a gentle push towards rebirth of a dynasty of kings. Proper management of their watery kingdoms will assure generations of wild salmon for years to come. Perhaps most important in this chain of protection is education. We must learn and we must teach others a higher sense of responsibility for future resources. Stewardship must be taught. We must all become responsible stewards of our rivers and streams. On the west coast of America, the beautiful, we are taking the first steps in our progress away from a century of neglect. That this journey can be successful is clear when you measure how far we have come in restoring the heritage of the king salmon in California. The pressures upon the king and his kingdom continue from many sides as mankind encroaches further upon the rivers, the ocean, the wilderness itself. New threats arise, threatening the king salmon's very existence. It is not enough to assume some public agency or industry will secure the salmon's safe future. The responsibility lies with each of us. We must protect the spawning grounds. We must assure the princelings of the king salmon safe passage to the sea. In each of our busy, complicated modern lives, we must take time to accept the role of stewardship to make that possible. We must ensure the return of the king.